Ah, my dear listener, sit next to me and relax. We are going on a journey through the dusty pages of time, listening to the whispers of the past. Today we will knock on the doors of the Renaissance and the early modern age, one of the most turbulent yet glorious periods in human history. Imagine a Europe plunged into darkness for centuries, a time when art withered, science was silenced, thought was in chains. But out of that darkness, like a dawn, the Renaissance was born. And what a dawn! A movement that questioned everything from the depths of the heavens to the complexities of the human soul. But wait, before I tell you this story, I must prepare you for that period. The Renaissance did not shine overnight. It came slowly, like the stars in the sky. At the end of the Middle Ages, the stage was set for the Black Death to sweep across Europe, for the dominance of the church to be shaken, and for cities to be transformed into centers of thought. And the actors on this stage were minds steeped in humanism, minds that rediscover the glorious legacy of ancient Greece and Rome, minds that put man at the center of the universe. Now, imagine a city. Philosophers in some of its streets, artists on street corners, and a feverish construction activity in the shadow of temples. To understand this story, we need to talk about those cities, those lives, and those minds. Now I ask you, in a world ravaged by the Black Death, how did people achieve such a glorious rebirth? How could the darkness be pierced by such a bright light? Here, my dear friend, I invite you to the first part of my story for the answers to these questions. Our journey begins. Hold on tight, because as one curtain opens on the stage of history, another curtain does not close, but only opens. Now, let's take a step back into the late Middle Ages. Let us listen to the first whispers that shaped human history. Ah, my dear friend, let us now go to the deep roots that prepared us for such a glorious period as the Renaissance. Roots that sprouted in the turbulent world of the late Middle Ages. Don't think that the Renaissance came out of nowhere. No, it came out of the ruins of the past, out of the darkness, through a painful transformation. The rebirth of humanity was made possible as the old order crumbled and new ideas flourished. Let us turn the first pages of this story together. Once upon a time, Europe was bound by the chains of a feudal structure ruled by landowners. While the feudal lords acted like petty kings in their lands, the peasants were at the bottom rung of this order. Time, however, leaves no one in their place. From the 14th century onwards, this seemingly solid structure began to crumble. The reason? Many things, but especially the development of trade and the growing wealth of the cities brought the end of this old order. Think of the city-states of Italy, Florence, Venice, Genoa. These cities broke free from the old feudal chains and gained their freedom. Located at the heart of trade routes, they became the economic center of Europe. Wealth was reshaped in markets filled with fabrics, spices, and exotic goods. The enriched bourgeois class was not content with merely owning property. They began to hunger for knowledge, art, and philosophy. The dissolution of the feudal order paved the way for a rebirth that sprouted in these cities. Now, imagine how the Black Death changed Europe. Beginning in 1347, this deadly epidemic took the lives of nearly 25 million people across the continent. Villages emptied and cities fell silent. However, it is an ironic fact of human history that great disasters sometimes open the door to great transformations. While the Black Death reduced the population, it increased the demand for labor. Surviving workers began to demand higher wages. The lower classes of society gained power, and the authority of feudal lords was further undermined. In addition, people began a deeper process of questioning in the wake of this great tragedy. The Church had failed to stop this catastrophe. Some even began to see its corruption as the cause of God's wrath. People began to look for a new path, both temporally and spiritually. This search would form the intellectual basis of the Renaissance. One of those who charted this new path were humanists. Humanism was a system of thought that put man and his potential at the center. Up until then, humanity had been molded by a God-centered worldview, but now human beings began to look back at themselves. Humanists rediscovered the forgotten heritage of ancient Greece and Rome. Ancient texts were pulled from dusty shelves, and the works of ancient philosophers were reread. Imagine a humanist wandering the narrow streets of Florence. He is holding texts by Cicero, Plato, or Seneca. In those texts they found not just knowledge, but a soul. Ideas that go deep into the human soul and try to make sense of life. These ideas were not just an intellectual movement, they laid the foundation stones for art, science, and even politics. However, these new ideas did not only remain on the pages of books, they resonated in city squares, workshops, and palaces. The artists, sculptors, architects, and thinkers of the Renaissance transformed this ancient inspiration into a new world. But how did this happen? Which names were the main actors of this transformation, and how did these ideas change the world? Well, my dear friend, we will find the answers to these questions in the next chapter. Now stop for a moment and think. How can one man change an era with an ancient text? Ah, my dear friend, we are now embarking on a journey that will take us back to the magical beginnings of the Renaissance. This journey begins in the warm stone streets of Italy, the city that changed the destiny of the whole of Europe and opened the door to the golden age of art and thought. And the center of this story is undoubtedly Florence. It is there that one of history's greatest awakenings begins to blossom, slowly but deeply rooted. By the late 14th century, Florence was the beating heart of the Italian Renaissance. But why Florence? Because this city was not only a center of trade, but also a melting pot of ideas, art, and innovation. Wealthy merchant families, especially the Medici family, played a critical role in this transformation. The Medici were no ordinary merchant dynasty. They used their banking wealth not only to get richer, but also to become patrons of the arts and sciences. Think of Cosimo de' Medici, my dear friend. He was the one who turned Florence into a temple of art. He supported the great talents of the time, from Donatello to Brunelleschi. But the Medici family's influence was felt not only in art, but also in politics. Although Florence was governed as a republic, in reality, it was under the influence of this family. this unique mix of the fascinating world of the Renaissance. Of course, Florence did not only shine thanks to wealthy patrons. There were geniuses in the city who pushed the boundaries of creativity, starting with Giotto. Ah, my dear friend, you know Giotto, don't you? He was one of the turning points in the history of art. He broke away from the earlier harsh and superficial figures and brought human emotion and depth to the canvas. In Giotto's frescoes, human stories came to life again, almost like a statue. Then came Masaccio. Masaccio was the artist who unlocked the secrets of perspective and gave the figures a real presence. His Holy Trinity, with its sense of depth that deceived the human eye, radically changed the understanding of art of the period. And of course, Brunelleschi. You know the huge dome of the famous Cathedral of Florence, Santa Maria del Fiore? That was the work of Brunelleschi's genius. That dome became a symbol not only of Florence, but of the whole Renaissance. He rediscovered engineering principles that had been forgotten since ancient Rome and blended them with new techniques. Looking at Brunelleschi's dome, you feel the birth of a civilization that pushed the limits of human imagination. Of course, the Renaissance was not limited to stones, frescoes, or domes. It was also a time of thought, literature, and self-discovery. Let's talk about Petrarca. He was a great humanist who revived Latin texts and opened an era with his writings about the inner world of man. But Petrarca's love was not only in words. He was a bridge that carried the stories of the past to the present. And Boccaccio, my dear friend, how can we forget his Decameron? In the Shadow of the Black Death, those stories that tell of all the complexities of human nature, while criticizing human weaknesses, Boccaccio also emphasized the beauty of these weaknesses and the meaning of being human. Humanism puts the human at the center because it believes that human beings are a universe waiting to be discovered. And this idea found an echo in the pen and brush of every thinker, every artist who walked the streets of Florence. But, my friend, it is time to ask a deeper question. Did all these ideas, artworks, and thoughts stay only in Florence? Or did they spread beyond Italy and influence the whole of Europe? We will move on to the next chapter to answer this question. But let me tell you in advance, this story will not end here, because the fire of the Renaissance once lit cannot be extinguished without lighting up the whole continent. Now I leave you wondering, how was this awakening received in other parts of Europe? Stay with me, dear friend, to find out. My dear friend, let me take you back to the golden age of the Renaissance. This was perhaps one of the most brilliant periods in human history, a time when art, science, and architecture rose in perfect harmony, a time when imagination and creativity knew no bounds. And when we stepped onto the stage of this period, the names that greeted us were not just artists or scientists, but living legends who had reached the pinnacle of human genius. Let's start with Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo. When you mention his name, are you just talking about a painter? Of course not. He was an inventor, an engineer, an anatomist, a philosopher, almost everything. Think about it, my dear friend. We are talking about a man who dug up graves and studied corpses to understand the inner structure of human figures. The man of Vitruvius was one of his greatest discoveries about the human being. It portrayed at the same time the aesthetics of art and the precision of science. And that painting, Mona Lisa, that work that people from all over the world gaze at for hours without taking their eyes off it, Leonardo had captured not just a face, but a soul on canvas. Mona Lisa's smile seemed to represent the essence of the Renaissance, that endless curiosity and search for meaning that lies deep within the human being. But let's go back to Michelangelo. Michelangelo was a magician who gave life to the stones. His David was not just a statue, but a symbol of human will. And when you look at the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, oh, my friend, you are out of this world. You are watching heaven. In these frescoes, Michelangelo tells not only religious stories, but also the relationship between man and God, the essence of creation, the miracle of life. These two geniuses not only pushed the boundaries of art, but also showed how man strives to understand himself. Thanks to them, art ceased to be a luxury and became a mirror of the human soul. Of course, we cannot describe this period only in terms of art, because the spread of knowledge was the greatest source of power of the Renaissance. Have you heard of Johannes Gutenberg? My dear friend, the man who invented the printing press in the 15th century and changed human history forever. But Gutenberg's printing press broke the chains of knowledge. Now even a common merchant or a farmer could access a Bible, a book of philosophy, or a scientific text. This was the fuel a knowledge-hungry society needed. Even Martin Luther's reforms were spread thanks to Gutenberg's printing press. And once knowledge spread, there was no stopping it. But now let me take you to the construction of another fascinating monument, St. Peter's Basilica. This basilica is the pinnacle of Renaissance architecture. The construction of this colossal structure began in 1506 and was a collaboration between giants such as Michelangelo, Bramante, and Raphael. When you look at its stone, you see not just a building, but a manifesto of human imagination, carved in stone. St. Peter's Basilica combined the splendor of ancient Rome and the spirituality of the Christian world. This revolution in architecture affected not only Italy, but the whole of Europe. People were no longer just building shelters with stone, but masterpieces to glorify God. But my dear friend, this golden age of the Renaissance also had a dark shadow. No matter how high science and art rose, the rest of Europe was still on the brink of a great transformation. So what was the connection between the Reformation and the Renaissance? How did religious conflicts shape this brilliant age? Let's pursue these questions in the next chapter. But for now, carry in your thoughts the genius of Leonardo, the magic of Michelangelo, and the revolution of Gutenberg. The light of the Renaissance will shine even brighter, you can be sure. Ah, my dear friend, welcome to a time when the magic of the Renaissance could no longer be felt only in the streets of Italy, but all over Europe. As this brilliant era of human history spread northward from the warm lands of Italy, it took on a character of its own, because each region reshaped the future for its own passion for innovation, pride, and national banding. He predicted that Hamilton would write the Bishop's Bed. Or regarded Northern Europe, we encounter another face of the Renaissance. The magnificent frescoes and sculptures of Italy gave way to paintings and wood carvings with incredible attention to detail. One of the most brilliant names of this period is Albrecht Dürer. When you look at Dürer's works, you see the world through the eyes of a scientist, not an artist. In his engravings you find the smallest details of nature and a search for meaning that goes deep into the human soul. Dürer was not only a technical genius, he was also a pioneer who broke down the boundaries between art and science. In his works, we witness the wind of humanism coming from Italy, combined with German rigor. And this gives us the essence of the Northern Renaissance, focusing on detail, putting the individual and the common man at the center. But you should also be aware that this period was shaped not only by brushstrokes. Let's remember Erasmus. Erasmus. This leading figure of humanism was not only a thinker, but a reformer. With his praise of madness, he subtly criticized the corrupt religious structure and social values of the time. Erasmus not only questioned the status quo, but also sought a new path for humanity. His works laid the intellectual foundations for the Northern Renaissance. But, my friend, Erasmus' writings foreshadowed a storm that was about to descend upon Europe. The Renaissance glorified human reason and liberated science and art. But this liberation was also increasing the pressure on the Church. For centuries, the Roman Catholic Church had remained the sole ruler of Europe. But with the invention of the printing press, information began to spread rapidly and people's access to holy books increased. Religion was no longer the monopoly of priests. People were questioning their own beliefs and criticizing the authority of the Church. The foundations of this cracking were laid with the Renaissance. The wave of humanism that began in Italy spread the idea of self-determination. The Church was no longer just a spiritual guide. It was also an object of questioning. Although the first sparks of the Reformation were lit by thinkers like Erasmus, they would soon turn into a giant fire in the hands of figures like Martin Luther. The spread of the Renaissance across Europe revolutionized not only the arts and sciences, but also the entire structure of society. Access to knowledge became easier, new ideas spread rapidly, and the foundations of the old order began to be shaken. But this transformation also brought with it great conflict. Because new ideas are always met with resistance, as Europe tried to embrace the innovations of the Renaissance, it also entered a period of division and turmoil. My dear friend, I would like to ask you now, how did this fractured structure pave the way for the birth of the Reformation? How did these new movements that challenged the authority of the Church shape the future of Europe? Let us pursue these questions in the next chapter. But remember, this story is not only about conflict, but also about the struggle for human liberation. The light of the Renaissance will lead us to an even deeper story. My dear friends, we are now stepping into perhaps one of the most turbulent periods in human history. The ideas ignited by the Renaissance and the crumbling authority of the Church soon became so heated that the European lands were divided on the basis of beliefs alone. This was not just a movement of religious innovation. It was also a revolution in which people found the courage to question their faith and their destiny. This complex story of the Reformation marked the beginning of one of the greatest transformations in history. In Wittenberg in 1517, a priest was quietly shaping a history that would be engraved with nails on the door of a church. This priest was Martin Luther, and the 95 theses he nailed to that door shook the religious order in Europe to its foundations. Luther challenged not only the corrupt practices of the church, but also the fundamental fallacies in its claim to spiritual leadership. He opposed the system of indulgences, which collected money in exchange for forgiven sins, saying that this practice led people not to spiritual salvation but to deception. But, my dear friends, as Luther's movement began to snowball, we realized that this was not an issue limited to the church. This movement advocated the idea that the individual could communicate directly with God. There was no longer any need for priests, church authority, or intermediary institutions. Luther's hammer blows opened not just a door, but the doors to spiritual freedom all over Europe. The movement started by Luther grew rapidly and split into various branches. These movements, united under the name of Protestantism, took root in different ways all over Europe. In Switzerland, another thinker named Johannes Calvin emerged. Calvinism interpreted the absolute authority of God and the role of man in this order in a different way. The doctrine of predestination, or fatalism, was one of the most striking features of this movement. The idea that people's fate is determined from birth opened a new theological debate, and Calvinists built their own communities with this idea and caused conflicts in various parts of Europe. On the other hand, a completely different story was unfolding in England. Henry VIII, after political and personal disagreements with the Pope, established Anglicanism and separated the English Church from Rome. This was not only a religious movement, but also a move that radically changed the political structure of England. The religious wars in Europe were now becoming the arena of not only a spiritual, but also a political struggle. But dear friends, history never allows for a one-sided struggle. The movements of Luther, Calvin, and other reformers had backed the Catholic Church into a corner. But this colossus was not going to give up. A great movement called the Counter-Reformation was launched. At the beginning of this movement, great efforts were made to restructure the Catholic Church and regain the lost trust of the people. The establishment of the Jesuit order was one of the most important steps in the Counter-Reformation. This order waged not only a religious, but also an educational and social struggle. But the Church's practices were not always so innocent. The Inquisition courts were used as a terrible tool to suppress irreligious ideas and reform movements. Witch hunts, sectarian conflicts, and exiles took place all over Europe. The Catholic Church did everything it could to preserve its authority, but the process also spread fear and violence across Europe. The Reformation transformed Europe not only religiously, but also culturally and politically. People now had more say over their beliefs. With the influence of the printing press, these ideas spread rapidly, and people began to question them. However, this process did not lead Europe to peace, but to the bloody religious wars of the 16th and 17th centuries. Dear friends, these stormy days of the Reformation shook Europe deeply, But history did not stop there. These conflicts would soon give birth to the ideas that would open the doors to the Enlightenment. But I would like to leave you with a question. What role did these religious revolutions that shaped Europe also play in humanity's transition to the Age of Reason? Let's look for the answer to this question together in the next chapter. Ah, my dear friends, now we open the hazy pages of history and set sail towards the great horizon, expanding adventures of mankind, the age of geographical discoveries, one of the most daring and at the same time one of the most turbulent periods in human history. It was not only a desire to explore unknown lands beyond the oceans, but also a struggle for survival, wealth, power, and a new world order. Those who sailed the oceans not only discovered new continents, but also changed the course of history forever. As Europe approached the end of the 15th century, the Mediterranean trade routes were under the control of the Ottoman Empire. For the powerful kingdoms of Europe, this meant that trade was cut off and access to valuable goods such as spices and silk became more difficult. It was at this time that countries like Spain and Portugal decided to look for new routes across the seas. But this search was more than just a matter of finding trade routes. Because the people of that time did not know where the boundaries of the world ended, what lay beyond the seas, and what riches the new lands held. Sailing the oceans was not only a physical exploration, but also a challenge to the unknown that required great courage. Portugal's brave captains, especially Vasco da Gama, managed to reach India by sailing around the south of Africa. This journey gave Portugal a great advantage in the spice trade. But, my dear friends, perhaps the most famous name in geographical discoveries is Christopher Columbus, who set sail under the Spanish flag in 1492. Columbus set out on this journey with the hope of reaching India and unexpectedly reached the American continent. Yes, he had unwittingly opened the door to the New World, but the economic and social consequences of these discoveries would change Europe and the rest of the world in unexpected ways. Columbus's successors not only discovered new continents, but also redrew the world's borders. Ferdinand Magellan set sail from Spain in 1519, launching one of the greatest sea expeditions in history. His aim was to sail westward to reach the east. This voyage, my dear friends, was filled not only with the challenges of the oceans, but also with hunger, rebellions, and unknowns. Magellan went down in history as the first man to cross the Pacific Ocean, but unfortunately he died in the Philippines. Yet his voyage went down in history as the first complete circumnavigation of the globe, and humanity began to understand just how big our planet is and what it holds. The impact of geographical discoveries was not limited to the redrawing of maps. The discovered lands were quickly colonized by the powerful states of Europe. In the Americas, the Spanish and Portuguese began a process of massacre and cultural assimilation in order to seize the riches of the local peoples and spread their civilization. Precious metals such as gold and silver flooded into Europe and laid the foundation for the economic system known as mercantilism. However, my dear friends, this wealth came at a heavy price. Indigenous peoples were ravaged by epidemics, and the slave trade marked one of the darkest periods in history. Millions of slaves were forcibly transported from Africa to the Americas and forced to work in inhumane conditions for the sake of European prosperity. This reveals that geographical discoveries were not only a chain of tragedies. Geographical discoveries broadened Europe's horizons, opened new trade routes, and ushered in the age of colonialism. But these discoveries had a profound impact not only on economics and politics, but also on culture and science. People began to better understand their place in the world. But, my dear friends, we cannot help asking the question, did these discoveries sow the seeds of the ideas that led Europe into the Age of Enlightenment? In the next installment, we will look for the answer to this question, and this time we will head towards the path illuminated by science and reason. So are you ready? We are sailing towards the light of the Enlightenment. Ah, my dear friends, we are now stepping into another turning point in history, an era when the human mind and curiosity pierced the skies. Sailing to new horizons with geographical discoveries, humanity was no longer only traveling to distant lands, but also to the stars, planets, and the secrets of the universe. This was an era when we began to understand not only knowledge, but also how to discover it, and question the order of the universe. The golden foundations of the scientific revolution. In the early 16th century, the first steps taken in the name of science were revolutionary. Until this period, the dominant understanding in Europe was the Earth-centered model of the universe developed by the ancient Greek astronomer Ptolemy. According to this model, everything in the universe, the sun, moon, planets, and stars, revolved around the Earth. This view, which was supported by the Church, created a confidence and arrogance that man was at the center of the universe. But Nicolaus Copernicus, a Polish astronomer, was brave enough to challenge this idea. Based on his observations, Copernicus proposed that the sun is at the center of the universe and that the planets revolve around it. This theory appeared in his work, De Revolutione Ibis Orbium Coelestium, and was a bombshell when it was published. It was a revolution that called into question not only the map of the sky, but also humanity's place in the universe. But because this view threatened the authority of the Church, Copernicus could not express his ideas much during his lifetime. But the seed had been planted and would soon take root. Copernicus's theory grew stronger in the hands of geniuses like Johannes Kepler. Kepler discovered that the orbits of the planets were not perfect circles, but ellipses. This discovery revolutionized the world of astronomy, using mathematical calculations to explain the movements of the planets. Kepler developed a deeper understanding of the order of the universe. Dear friends, Kepler's discoveries pioneered not only astronomy, but also physics and the modern understanding of science. He showed that the universe was not chaos, but mathematical order. But the most remarkable name of this period is undoubtedly Galileo Galilei. Galileo believed that science should progress not only with theories, but also with experiments and observations. When he looked at the sky with the telescope he invented, what he saw deeply shook not only the world of science, but also the authority of the Church. Galileo discovered the 4 major moons of Jupiter and studied craters on the surface of the moon. These findings proved that the sky was not just a sacred space, but a nature that could be studied. Galileo's heliocentric theory of the universe, which he defended by saying, "Eper si move," it still revolves, was seen as heresy by the Church. He was brought before the Inquisition and forced to deny his views. But my dear friends, Galileo's faith and scientific determination allowed us to lay the foundations of modern science. Perhaps the most important aspect of the scientific revolution was that it was not limited to discoveries. During this period, science gained a method. This method, based on the principles of experiment, observation, and logic, liberated the human mind and systematized access to knowledge. This so-called scientific method, scientists study ideas, principles, and logic to figure out how it's defendable, enabled us not only to understand the physical world, but also to open the door to a fairer, more rational society. My dear friends, the scientific revolution is not just an explosion of knowledge, but the courage of man to transcend his own limits. It is the awakening of a mind that questions everything from the stars in the sky to the atoms on Earth. So, what kind of future has this awakening brought us to? How did humanity build technology, industry in the modern world with the power of this scientific revolution? In our next episode, we will witness the rise of the Industrial Revolution. Are you ready? Let's discover together how those giant wheels started to turn. My dear friends, there was a time when the reigns of kings and queens shaped not only the borders of their countries, but also the fate of their people. The 16th and 17th centuries were the peak of these monarchical powers in Europe, when thrones became even higher and monarchs became almost godlike figures. But this was not only the golden age of absolutist regimes. There was also a time when royal authority was tested and different models of governance began to emerge. Let me take you inside this complex and fascinating history. In the southwest of Europe, a monarch on the throne of Spain dreamed of controlling not only his country, but almost all of Europe. Charles V, this powerful leader of the House of Habsburg, ruled over Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, and colonies in the Americas. But such a vast empire was not only a source of power, but also a burden. Charles V was plagued by religious conflicts during the Protestant Reformation. The movement of Martin Luther echoed throughout his empire, shaking the foundations of the Catholic faith. Charles, as the defender of Catholicism, waged war against the Protestants, but this struggle weakened the empire both financially and militarily. Nevertheless, during his reign, Spain became a powerful example of authoritarianism. As God's representative on earth, the emperor tried to manage the fate of his people from a single hand. But Charles V eventually succumbed to the weight of this burden, abdicated the throne to his son, and retired to a monastery. His legacy was built on a combination of absolutism and religious authority. But this combination exacerbated conflicts in other parts of Europe. Friends. One of the first names that comes to mind when we think of absolutism is undoubtedly Louis XV. Known in history as the Sun King, Louis deserved this title not only as a metaphor, but also for the way he ruled. Sitting on the throne of France at a young age, Louis gathered all the powers in his hands, almost saying, "I am the state." The splendor of the Palace of Versailles was not only an architectural marvel, but also a symbol of absolutism. In his palace, Louis weakened the nobles by drawing them to his side and took the state under his complete control. But his rule was not limited to the internal affairs of France. Louis XIV tried to change the balance in Europe through wars, making France a superpower after the 30 Years' War, Louis promised prosperity to his people on the one hand and deepened poverty by increasing the tax burden on the other. The light of the Sun King shined brightly in his palace, but most of his people were deprived of this radiance. However, my dear friends, in one corner of Europe, a different path was being followed. England. Here, the power of kings was not unlimited, but had to be balanced by the representatives of the people. The era of Charles I and Cromwell is one of the most dramatic stories of this process. Desiring an absolutist rule, Charles I tried to overrule the powers of Parliament. However, this attempt brought England to the brink of civil war. Led by Oliver Cromwell, the power of the people and Parliament overthrew the king. The execution of Charles I reverberated not only in the history of England, but also in Europe. Even after the end of Cromwell's reign, England never returned to a fully absolutist regime. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 consolidated the concept of parliamentary monarchy and carried England into the future with a different model of government. In the 16th and 17th centuries, absolutism in Europe was a period of centralized state power, and monarchs became almost godlike figures. But it was also a time when thrones were shaken, and the demands of the people and thinkers for freedom were rising. Ah, my dear friends, these conflicts over the throne were felt not only in the corridors of the palaces, but also in the streets and squares of the people. So how did the rising voice of the people take shape in the shadow of the thrones? How did the 18th century Enlightenment thinkers defend human reason, freedom, and the power of the individual? In the next installment, we will trace the ideas that would light up the Age of Enlightenment. Are you ready? Let's keep learning. Dear friends, now I am going to take you on a journey into one of the most turbulent periods of history, deep into the 16th and 17th centuries. While bells tolled in the cities of Europe, faraway war cries rang out, and the tension between the old order and new ideas grew more and more intense every day. This was not only an age of clashing swords, but also a time when words and ideas were as powerful as weapons. Let us step into the complex world of wars and diplomacy of the early modern period. It all started with a dispute between the defenders of religious freedom and the guardians of political authority. The 30 Years' War, sparked in Bohemia in 1618, soon turned into a massive conflagration that swept across Europe. The struggle between Catholics and Protestants initially appeared to be a religious issue, but behind the scenes, there were political ambitions, territorial gains, and balance of power games. At that time, my friends, the Protestant nobility of Bohemia rebelled against the Catholic oppression of the Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand II. Remember the famous defenestration, the window incident in Prague? The rebel leaders threw the Habsburg representatives out of a window. This was the first spark of the war. But the war did not stop at the borders of Bohemia. Great powers like Spain, Sweden, France, and even Denmark joined the chaotic struggle. Blood was spilled in every corner of Europe. Fields were devastated, cities burned, and people fell into poverty. For 30 years, the flames of war were never extinguished. Finally, in 1648, after a long and painful negotiation process, the Treaty of Westphalia was signed. This treaty not only marked the end of the war, but also paved the way for modern diplomacy. The balance between Catholics and Protestants was restored, and religious freedoms were partially guaranteed. But more importantly, it laid the foundations for balance of power politics in Europe. It was the end of one era and the beginning of another. With Westphalia, secular diplomacy began to dominate interstate relations for the first time. The influence of the Habsburgs waned, France rose to prominence, and Europe saw the rise of independent nation-states rather than the old empires. But peace came at a price. The war left millions dead, ruined cities, and a depleted continent. Ah, dear friends, the new order that began with Westphalia laid the foundation for centuries of political games in Europe. The balance of power policy was based on not allowing one state to dominate another. It was a chess game in which diplomacy and war were intertwined. France, Sweden, England, and the Habsburgs were the main players in this game and weakened their opponents. But my friends, even when the wars ended, dark clouds continued to hang over Europe, because each peace treaty often contained the seeds of the next conflict. Did Westphalia really bring lasting peace, or was it just a truce? And what about now? Will we look at the stories of states and leaders lost in the tangled web of diplomacy of the early modern period? Or will we trace the conflicts that followed? Ah, my friends, I will now take you into the glittering and dramatic world of the 17th century, a time of wars and conflicts, but also a time when art and culture soared, when people shouted out their pain and faith with brushes, stones, and notes. In every corner of Europe, the works of art created during that period were like living storytellers. Sometimes under the light of a candle, you would face Caravaggio's paintings. Sometimes you would reach the peak of an emotion in Bernini's sculptures. Baroque was not a simple and serene art. On the contrary, it was a visual feast that revealed all the splendor and complexity of the human spirit. Baroque art, as soon as you hear its name, you think of intense drama, sharp contrasts, and splendor. But if you ask why it was so impressive, we need to understand the roots of this period. Baroque was born in Rome at the end of the 16th century and soon spread throughout Europe. But it was not just an aesthetic preference. In Europe at the time, the Catholic Church wanted religious art to be expressive and powerful as a counter-move against the Protestant Reformation. Art was a tool, a kind of sacred theater, a means to make us feel the glory of God. And here we have paintings coming out from under Caravaggio's brush. Caravaggio. Is it possible to see his works and not have your soul tremble? Even his own life was like a Baroque story, passionate, chaotic, and tragic. In his paintings, light and shadow defy each other. Reality hits you in the face. Remember his The Calling of St. Matthew? In a dimly lit room, a beam of light illuminates a divine hand calling a man. It is not just a painting, it is a story, the embodiment of a moment of destiny. Another great name, Gian Lorenzo Bernini. Ah, my friends, take a look at his sculptures, and let me show you how a piece of stone can convey emotion so deep that they can make you cry. Behold the Assumption of Saint Teresa. This marble masterpiece conveys a mystical experience in such a way that you feel as if God himself is appearing in front of you. The deep trance on Teresa's face, the angel's arrow hovering gently in the air as he turns towards her. This is not just a sculpture, but a divine journey of the soul. In another of Bernini's masterpieces, David, you witness the culmination of a movement. As David prepares to throw his slingshot at the giant Goliath, all his muscles are tense, his face is focused. This is the essence of Baroque. It tells a story in motion, not in stillness. But the magic of the Baroque was not only in the Catholic world. In Northern Europe, in areas dominated by Protestants, the art of this period also appeared with a completely different face. In the Netherlands, Rembrandt van Rijn shed light on even the darkest corners of the human soul. The faces in his portraits hid not only the outward appearance, but also the whole life, sufferings, and triumphs of the person. In the painting Night Patrol, a group of soldiers appear as if on a theater stage in motion. But this is not just an ensemble. Each face is part of a story. Ah, my friends, to understand why the Baroque conveyed such intense emotion, we need to look at the backdrop of the period. The deep conflicts between Catholics and Protestants made art not just an aesthetic expression. Both sides wanted to glorify their beliefs and influence their people through art. Churches were filled with huge frescoes. Musicians composed melodies of the organ that made people feel closer to God. But the interesting thing is that the artists of this period showed not only faith, but also the inner turmoil of human beings. The Baroque works hid the fact that everything in life is temporary, that even victory will one day fade away. This idea, called memento mori, was reflected in the skulls in the paintings and the fading petals of flowers. So what came after this dramatic and glamorous period? How did the splendor of Baroque art give way to a simpler and more symmetrical style? Are you ready to discover why people moved from this exuberance to a search for serenity? Then, my friends, our next story will take us into the light and elegant world of Rococo. Dear friends, I take you now from the splendor of the Baroque art to the turbulent economic and social transformations of the 16th and 17th centuries. At that time, Europe was undergoing a process of evolution in which not only art and religion, but also the social structure and economic order were radically altered. The flow of trade, money, and people overflowed like a river, changed the face of humanity, and forever turned the world. And my friends, this is the story of a great revolution that shaped the lives not only of merchants and rulers, but also of ordinary people. In the 16th century, the world map expanded, friends. The discoveries that began with Columbus arriving in America, Vasco da Gama reaching India, and Magellan sailing around the world opened up whole new trade routes. The former glory of the Silk Road gave way to the power of the oceans. Spices, gold, and silver, the exotic fabrics of Asia, and the riches of America poured into European ports. This massive flow of trade not only increased wealth, it fundamentally changed Europe's economic system. Land used to be the basis of wealth. But now the era of money, or capital, was beginning. This is how early capitalism was born. Port cities like London, Amsterdam, and Seville became the epicenters of this new order. Merchants, sailors, and bankers were the lords of the new economy. Stop here and imagine, dear listeners. While the canals of Amsterdam were crowded with freighters, a stock on the stock exchange could fetch a fortune. The world's first modern stock exchange was founded in Amsterdam in 1602. And this is where the bourgeoisie appeared on the scene. This new class was neither tied to the land like the nobles, nor condemned to hard labor like the peasants. The bourgeoisie was a class that prospered through trade, crafts, and entrepreneurial culture. They built their homes in the center of cities, wore flamboyant clothes, and became the new patrons of culture, supporting artists. The rise of the bourgeoisie was not only an economic change, but also a social revolution. These people were reshaping society, breaking the chains of the old feudal order. Cities also grew rapidly during this period. London, Paris, Venice, and other big cities became cauldrons not only of trade, but also of ideas. Urbanization laid the foundations of the modern class structure. In the cities, there were the mansions of rich merchants on the one hand, and the narrow streets of the working class on the other. Society was becoming complex with new classes and new identities. It was also during this period that people's search for individual freedom became more pronounced. But my friends, this new economic order carried with it old conflicts. The Protestant Reformation in particular affected economic dynamics. Protestantism emphasized hard work and thrift, and this ethic fed the spirit of early capitalism. At the same time, economic competition between Catholic and Protestant countries triggered trade wars. These transformations in the 16th and 17th centuries actually laid the foundations for today's world. The rise of capitalism, urbanization, and the sharpening of class differences shaped the modern economic and social structure. But when you think about the human stories behind these changes, you can see how turbulent it was. How did this rapid change affect the way people lived, believed, and perceived the world? How did art, science, and philosophy adapt to this new world? Next time, we will talk about the first lights of the Age of Enlightenment and the struggle for the liberation of the human mind. Are you ready? Dear friends, I have just described how the modern economic and social structure took shape, and now we are moving towards a time when human thought is breaking its chains and imagining a new world in the light of reason and inquiry. As we approach the end of the early modern era, when philosophy and science underwent a profound transformation, individuals began to search not only for ways to survive, but also for the meaning of life and the secrets of the universe. It is here that we encounter the pioneers of the Enlightenment. With their bold thinking, they broke the chains of the human mind and laid the foundations of the modern world. My friends, there was a thinker named Thomas Hobbes who lived in the bleak atmosphere of the 17th century. He witnessed the bloody scenes of the Civil War in England, and this dark period shaped his thinking. Hobbes took a harsh view of human nature, depicting a state of nature in which everyone was at war against everyone else. According to him, people were selfish by nature, and the only way out of this chaos was the existence of a strong state. In Leviathan, he argued that the state should control everything like a monster. Although this monster may seem frightening, it was the only force that could maintain social order. Hobbes's ideas were the beginning of the endless debate between authority and freedom, a debate that would echo in the brilliant minds of the Enlightenment. But my friends, at the same time in France, another man was traveling a very different path from the harsh realism of Thomas Hobbes. His name was René Descartes. His philosophy was based on understanding the world through questioning and doubt. You may have heard the phrase, cogito, ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. This phrase emphasized the power of the human mind and individual thought. According to Descartes, it was necessary to doubt everything in order to reach true knowledge. This method liberated science and philosophy from dogmas. His work revolutionized many fields, from mathematics to physics, and laid the foundations of the modern scientific method. And now, my friends, I would like to introduce you to another great name, Francis Bacon. He was the first great proponent of the scientific method. Bacon believed that the way to understand and control nature was through experimentation and observation. He refused to stick to old dogmas and said that knowledge must be constantly renewed. Bacon, who said knowledge is power, was not content with theories, but advocated practical knowledge that would benefit humanity. His scientific method paved the way for the likes of Newton and Galileo and ushered in the modern era of science. Dear listeners, thinkers like Hobbes, Descartes, and Bacon represent a turning point in the intellectual evolution of humanity. Their ideas have shaped not only their time, but also our world. Hobbes showed us the importance of order and authority, Descartes the power of individual thought, and Bacon that science is the greatest tool for humanity. Ah, my dear friends, we have come to the end of another journey. History is like a river. Some of its currents flow calmly and peacefully, while others echo through the centuries with their turbulence and waves. Today, we have traced the course of this river through the 16th and 17th centuries, a period shaped by wars, ideas, art, and economics. The groundbreaking ideas that opened the door to the Enlightenment and the events that pushed the boundaries of the human spirit. Rest assured, this is just the beginning. In each narrative, we have seen how complex yet courageous humanity is. Sometimes they tried to conquer the world with their mighty armies. Sometimes they revealed their souls in paintings, sculptures, and words. And behind all this effort was the search for a better life and a more meaningful world. Remember, my friends, history is not only the story of the past. It is also a mirror helping us understand our present and our future. The lessons we learn from these periods are perhaps as valuable as the great events of that era. At the end of the 17th century, humanity was preparing to step into a new era, a new mentality. The light of the Enlightenment would usher in an era that questioned the thrones of kings, the traditions of societies, and the limits of human reason. But that is a story for another time, isn't it? It has been a great honor for me to be here today to tell you this story. But now, it is up to you to complete this story with your thoughts. Humanity has built the present with the choices of the past. But what about us? What kind of future are we building with the decisions we make today? I ask you to think about this question, because history is not only about listening, but also about understanding and learning from it.